Detective Jane Marple, The Final Verdict, a courtroom mystery. The courtroom was a cathedral of authority, its high vaulted ceiling amplifying every shuffle, every suppressed whisper. Chandeliers glowed dimly above, their brass fixtures reflecting the soft gaslight that lent the chamber a golden hue. The scent of polished mahogany and aging legal tomes mingled with the faint, almost imperceptible tension that hummed beneath the surface. At the centre of it all, seated rigidly behind the defendant's table, was Charles Redgrave. His once proud countenance bore the weary resignation of a man walking to the gallows. Impeccably dressed in a tailored charcoal suit, his greying hair was neatly combed, his angular features composed. Yet there was something in the set of his jaw, the distant gaze in his deep-set green eyes, that suggested a man who had already accepted his fate. Across from him, the prosecution loomed. Vivian Drake, a woman whose sharp gaze cut as deeply as her words. She stood with an air of quiet triumph, her navy mule suit crisp, her auburn hair pinned back in an unforgiving chignon. On the judge's bench, his lordship Alderton adjusted his spectacles, then struck the gavel. "Proceed." A murmuring ripple ran through the gallery, where society's finest had gathered. Murder trials, after all, provided excellent theatre. Lady Granville, a dowager of severe posture, sat whispering behind her fan. A few rows back, Paul Ashford, the deceased's nephew, observed the proceedings with an inscrutable expression, one leg crossed over the other, and in an unassuming seat, knitting needles clicking softly, Agatha Marple watched. "Members of the jury," Drake began, stepping forward, "what you will hear today is not a tale of mystery, nor one of speculation, but of cold, irrefutable fact." Her voice, measured and clear, carried effortlessly across the room. Reginald Hawthorne, a respected businessman, was found murdered in his study at precisely 9:10 p.m. on the night of the 4th of October. A single gunshot to the heart. And the weapon? She turned to the evidence table, where a revolver gleamed under the gaslight. This 0.38 caliber revolver registered to Charles Red. The jury exchanged glances. "Now," Drake continued, pacing slowly, "it is no secret that the relationship between Mr. Redgrave and the deceased had soured in recent months. A financial dispute, accusations of embezzlement, a partnership crumbling under the weight of distrust." She let the words settle before delivering the coup de grace. "And witnesses saw Mr. Redgrave leaving the scene of the crime." A murmur swept the gallery. Agatha Marple, still knitting, barely lifted her gaze. Instead, her ears were attuned to the nuances, the tremor in Redgrave's fingers as he clenched them together, the slight flicker in Emily Hawthorne's eyes at the mention of embezzlement, the way Beatrice Redgrave, Charles's estranged wife, kept her gaze fixed on the floor, her lips pursed in something that was not quite sorrow. She had seen many a courtroom drama unfold, and experience had taught her one invaluable truth: the obvious was rarely the truth. Defense counsel Leonard Graves stood, a man whose thinning hair and crumpled papers suggested he had battled against many an unwinnable case. He cleared his throat. "The prosecution presents a compelling narrative, but narratives are not proof." Drake smirked. "Proof, Mr. Graves." She gestured, and Detective Inspector Wallace stepped forward, his crisp uniform starched to perfection. "The murder weapon was found near the victim's body," Wallace stated. "It was Mr. Redgrave's gun." Leonard Graves adjusted his spectacles. "And the forensic evidence?" Wallace hesitated. "Just a moment, but long enough." "There were no fingerprints," he admitted. A rustling among the jury. "No fingerprints." Drake recovered quickly. "The defendant could have wiped the weapon after use." "Or," Leonard countered smoothly, "it was planted." Silence. Then the judge rapped his gavel once. "We shall hear the witness testimonies." As the first witness was called, Agatha Marple finally paused in her knitting. She leaned slightly forward, her blue eyes gleaming with quiet interest. "A gun, registered to the defendant, found at the crime scene, yet no fingerprints. A widow, too composed in grief. A business partner, dead amidst whispers of financial ruin. A courtroom eager to convict. It was all so very convenient. A stitch, a click, a thoughtful nod. Perhaps, she mused, a murder had been committed after all, but not the one everyone believed. The air inside courtroom No. 3 was thick with the scent of old wood and the hush of expectancy. Dust floated in lazy spirals through the heavy golden light streaming from the grand chandelier overhead, casting elongated shadows over the solemn faces of the jury. Outside the grand arched windows, the restless city of London murmured beyond the courthouse walls. But here, within this mahogany-panelled chamber, only the business of justice mattered. At the prosecution's table, Vivian Drake stood with the practised ease of a woman accustomed to command. She was dressed in navy blue serge, severe yet sophisticated, her sharp gaze flitting between the assembled faces like a bird of prey selecting its meal. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," she began, her voice clear and unwavering. "What we have before us is not a mystery." She paused, letting the words settle, as though inviting them to enjoy the simplicity of the statement. "It is not a tale spun of intrigue, nor a matter shrouded in speculation. It is, in every sense of the word, an inevitability." A murmur rippled through the gallery, filled as it was with society's vultures, society ladies pretending disinterest behind delicate fans, bespectacled gentlemen murmuring their opinions in hushed tones, and a handful of reporters scribbling furiously, the ink drying on what would surely be tomorrow's scandalous headline. In the second row, quietly unremarkable, save for the rhythmic click of her knitting needles, Agatha Marple listened. She was unassuming, her small figure half lost beneath a sensible tweed coat, her expression one of mild attentiveness. But behind the round spectacles and the placid demeanour, her sharp mind was already working, spinning, unravelling, reforming. At the defence table, Charles Redgrave remained composed, but there was a weariness about him, not the desperation of a guilty man, but the resignation of one who sees the tide rising and knows he cannot hold it back. His defence attorney, Leonard Graves, seemed almost as defeated, his spectacles perched precariously on the bridge of his nose, and his fingers shuffled through notes as though hoping to conjure a miracle from fading ink. Drake resumed. "The motive," she declared crisply, "is clear." She turned slightly, gesturing toward the assembled jury. Reginald Hawthorne and Charles Redgrave were not merely business partners, they were men of influence, men whose dealings shaped industries and lined pockets. But partnerships, as we well know, do not always remain equal. She let her gaze settle on the jury, pausing just long enough to create tension. Over a past year, the deceased, Mr. Hawthorne, grew increasingly suspicious that Mr. Redgrave had been siphoning funds from their joint investment firm, sumptuous sums that somehow vanished into thin air. There were accusations, arguments, and finally, she took a breath, just the right shade of regretful, threats. A low murmur from the gallery. She continued. "The means—" She pivoted slightly, gesturing to the evidence table where a gleaming revolver rested on a velvet cushion, a damning artifact of guilt. "The murder weapon found at the scene was none other than Mr. Redgrave's own revolver." She let that statement rest in the air for a moment before pressing forward, her voice sharpening. "And the opportunity? Witnesses placed Mr. Redgrave at the Hawthorne estate that night. He was seen arriving shortly before the fatal hour, 9:10 p.m., and he was seen leaving less than 20 minutes later." A hush settled over the room. It was the kind of silence that clung to the walls, heavy, oppressive, expectant. Even Judge Alderton, a man rarely moved by rhetoric, allowed the weight of the moment to sink in before he cleared his throat. "Proceed, Miss Drake." She stepped back slightly, smoothing her gloves. "The prosecution calls Detective Inspector Wallace to the stand." The courtroom doors swung open, admitting a square-jawed man in a crisp navy uniform, his heavy boots striking the floor with a purposeful rhythm. He took the stand, his expression stoic. Drake approached, tilting her head slightly, as if assessing his credibility, as though she didn't already know he would say precisely what she needed him to. "Inspector Wallace," she began, Please recount for the court what you found at the scene." Wallace nodded. "At 9:25 p.m. police were summoned to Hawthorne Manor by the housekeeper, Mrs. Parker. Upon arrival, we found the deceased, Reginald Hawthorne, slumped over his desk, single gunshot wound to the chest, immediate cause of death." Drake nodded, guiding him along. "And the weapon?" "The revolver was found on the floor beside the victim's chair. No fingerprints. A flicker of something, perhaps irritation?" Crossed Drake's face, but she masked it well. "And who does the weapon belong to?" "Charles Redgrave." A gasp, though not unexpected, rippled through the court. Drake turned to the jury. "The man murdered in his own study. His business partner's gun lying beside him. An argument over money. And our accused was seen leaving the estate within minutes of the fatal shot." She stepped back, allowing her words to linger. "It is, as I said, an inevitability." Agatha Marple observed the shifting faces in the gallery, the careful arrangement of facts, the ease with which they built the case. A case that, at first glance, seemed airtight. And yet, a gun with no fingerprints, a murder at precisely 9:10 p.m., a defendant who seemed resigned rather than desperate, and a prosecutor who was perhaps a shade too confident. A small, almost imperceptible smile crossed her lips as she resumed knitting. Nothing was ever quite as simple as it seemed. The Old Bailey had seen many things within its hallowed halls. Justice served, reputations dismantled, men sentenced with the stroke of a gavel. Today it was the scene of a trial that had captured the imagination of London's finest and most ruthless gossip-mongers. The great courtroom was a monument to authority, its mahogany walls polished to a sombre sheen, the weight of the law pressing against the air. A vast chandelier hung from the ceiling, its dim golden light doing little to dispel the solemnity of the proceedings. The pews were lined with society's elite, ladies wrapped in furs despite the warmth of the room, gentlemen adjusting their cufflinks, as if the outcome of the trial were merely a point of intellectual curiosity, rather than a matter of life and death. Agatha Marple, settled comfortably in the second row, appeared as an inconspicuous presence among them. She was dressed in sensible tweed, her silver hair tucked neatly beneath a modest hat, her gloved hands occupied with her knitting, a delicate cream-coloured affair that grew steadily beneath her fingers. One might have mistaken her for a woman idly whiling away the time, a tourist in the city perhaps. But those who underestimated Agatha Marple often found she observed everything. At the defence table, Charles Redgrave sat with the air of a man who had resigned himself to fate. His hands were clasped together, his once proud features now set in a mask of quiet dignity. He neither protested nor fidgeted, merely waited, his green eyes unreadable. Beside him, Leonard Graves, the defence attorney, rifled through his... He was a thin man, his spectacles perched precariously on the bridge of his nose, his dark suit slightly wrinkled. Graves had the look of a man who knew he was fighting a losing battle, but was determined to go down swinging. In contrast, Judge Alderton, presiding over the proceedings, carried himself with the weight of absolute certainty. His powdered white wig rested squarely on his head, a symbol of both tradition and the quiet tyranny of law. He was not a man given to sentiment, nor one to tolerate nonsense. His eyes, sharp as a hawk's, scanned the courtroom with the unwavering precision of a man who had long since learned to spot deceit at 20 paces. And then there was Beatrice Redgrave, seated in the gallery, her back ramrod straight, her lips painted a shade too dark, her gloved hands folded elegantly over one another, as though she were merely an interested party rather than the wife of the accused. Her beauty was still formidable, but time had sharpened her features rather than softened them. She had the air of a woman who had suffered many disappointments and found a quiet satisfaction in witnessing one more. Agatha Marple's eyes flicked toward her, a curious thing, really, that Beatrice Redgrave had chosen to attend the trial of a man she so clearly despised. Not in mourning, nor in desperation, but with a quiet, calculating amusement. Interesting. At the prosecution's table, Vivian Drake adjusted her papers, the set of her shoulders rigid, her expression sharp as a knife. The case was hers to win, and she knew it. The gavel struck and silence rippled through the room. Judge Alderton peered down at the assembled parties, his voice clipped and without ornament. "Proceed!" Drake rose, her heels clicking against the marble floor. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," she began, "we are here today to ensure that justice is served, that the truth, unclouded by sentiment or misdirection, is revealed." She turned slightly as if surveying them, but her words were directed toward one person only, Charles Redgrave. "The facts of this case are simple," she continued. "On the night of October the 4th, Reginald Hawthorne, esteemed businessman and philanthropist, was found dead in his study, the victim of a single gunshot wound to the chest. The murder weapon, this revolver," she gestured to the polished gun resting on the evidence table, "belonged to none other than Charles Redgrave." She let the words settle, the gravity of them weighing down upon the jury like stones in their pockets. Agatha Marple did not look at the revolver. She looked at Charles Redgrave, whose jaw tensed ever so slightly, and at Beatrice, whose expression did not shift at all. "Furthermore," Drake continued, "Mr. Redgrave was seen leaving the Hawthorne estate at approximately 9:10 p.m., the precise moment the shot was fired." A murmur rippled through the courtroom, as it always did at the confirmation of damning evidence. Agatha merely clicked her knitting needles together thoughtfully. So simple, so neat, almost too neat. At the defence table, Leonard Graves cleared his throat, pushing his glasses up his nose as if doing so might buy him time. "Your Honour, if I may—" Judge Alderton fixed him with a stare that could curdle milk. "I would suggest, Mr. Graves, that you save your protestations for when the prosecution has finished presenting its case." Graves swallowed, nodding. Across the room, Beatrice's lips curled ever so slightly at the corners. "Fascinating," the prosecution continued, its argument methodical, unyielding. It was an open and shut case, they claimed, and yet, as Agatha Marple observed the scene before her, the quiet rage beneath Beatrice Redgrave's composure, the barely concealed panic in Graves's fumbling, the unnerving calm of Charles Redgrave, she was quite certain of one thing. Nothing in this case was open and shut. She pulled her knitting needle through another loop, the thread tightening. The real question was, who had tied the noose? The air in the courtroom had grown heavier, a silent pressure of expectation settling over the assembled figures. It was the peculiar weight that only came when a trial was in full motion, the kind where reputations hung by threads, and fate played out beneath the watchful eyes of the public. Prosecutor Vivian Drake stood at the centre of it all, the pulse of the case beating at her measured pace. She was not a woman who relied on theatrics. She did not need to. Her voice, clipped and precise, had the authority of certainty, and it carried through the cavernous chamber like the toll of a bell. She turned toward the first witness, her expression unreadable. Paul Ashford, the nephew and heir of the late Reginald Hawthorne, sat in the witness stand with the practised ease of a man accustomed to being observed. He was young, well-dressed, and exuded the kind of charm that was effortless, but not without calculation. His dark hair was immaculately styled, and his green eyes held an edge of amusement, as though the entire proceeding were merely an inconvenience, a mildly interesting diversion before he claimed what was rightfully his. Drake regarded him with cool detachment. "Mr. Ashford, as the deceased's closest surviving relative, you stand to inherit the bulk of his estate, do you not?" A slight smile played at the corners of his lips. "Yes, that is correct." There was a murmur from the gallery, though it was hardly a revelation. Everyone knew Paul Ashford had much to gain from his uncle's death. Drake did not return the smile. "Tell me, Mr. Ashford, what was your relationship with your uncle?" Paul gave an elegant shrug. "We were cordial, I suppose. My uncle was a man of certain expectations, a perfectionist, you might say." He exhaled lightly, as though the very thought exhausted him. "He liked things done in a particular way. Unfortunately, I am not a man who enjoys being dictated to." "In other words," Drake said smoothly, Your uncle did not approve of your lifestyle? Paul smirked. If you mean my fondness for cards, travel, and the occasional indiscretion, then yes, he most certainly did not approve. A ripple of subdued laughter flitted through the gallery before the judge rapped his gavel once. And yet, Drake continued, ignoring the distraction, you were named as his heir. Paul's smirk faded just slightly. I suppose blood ties run deeper than personal differences. Drake's gaze did not waver. Blood ties? Or something more? There it was. The pause, the flicker of something unreadable in Paul Ashford's eyes. Agatha Marple observed the slight tightening of his fingers, the brief but unmistakable glance toward Emily Hawthorne, the widow. Interesting. Paul regained his composure almost immediately. I'm not sure what you mean, Miss Drake. Drake let the silence stretch before she turned slightly, her voice neutral. No further questions? The next witness, Emily Hawthorne, took the stand with an air of practised composure. She was a woman of striking beauty, though age and grief had etched their marks upon her. Her platinum blonde hair was swept into an elegant chignon, her mourning attire impeccable, her pale hands folded demurely in her lap. Drake approached, her tone shifting ever so slightly, less aggressive, more insidious. Mrs. Hawthorne, she began, you were in the house at the time of your husband's murder? Emily inclined her head. Yes, I was in my dressing room preparing for the evening. And you heard nothing? A small, perfectly controlled sigh. I heard the clock strike 9. A few moments later I heard a noise, something like a chair being pushed back, or perhaps a book falling. It was not enough to alarm me. Drake tilted her head slightly. No gunshot? Emily's lips parted, and for the briefest moment something flickered behind her eyes. Then it was gone. No. A murmur spread through the courtroom. A gunshot fired in the house, and yet you did not hear it? Emily's gaze remained steady. Old houses have thick walls. Agatha Marple's needles paused for half a second before resuming their quiet rhythm. A shot that wasn't heard, how very inconvenient. Drake did not press further. No further questions. The final witness of the afternoon was Detective Inspector Wallace. He was a man of precise habits and unwavering conviction, his police uniform crisp, his every movement efficient. He stood before the court as a man who believed in the simplicity of evidence and facts, with little patience for speculation. Drake wasted no time. Inspector Wallace, you were the first to examine the crime scene. Yes. Describe what you found. Wallace's voice remained firm. The body of Reginald Hawthorne was discovered in his study at approximately 9:25 p.m. He was slumped over his desk. A single gunshot wound to the chest. Death was instantaneous. The weapon? A .38 caliber revolver registered to the defendant Charles Redgrave. It was found on the floor beside the chair. Drake nodded. And the position of the wound? Close range, Wallace confirmed. Fired directly at the heart, a professional shot. There was a slight stir at those words. Drake leaned in slightly. And the state of the gun? Wallace hesitated only slightly before answering, wiped clean. Agatha Marple's knitting needles stilled. That should have been the most damning evidence of all. A gun with no fingerprints, but Miss Marple knew something most did not. When something is too neat, too precise, it ceases to be natural. Drake continued. So, let us be clear, the murder weapon belonged to the defendant. It was found at the crime scene, and Mr. Redgrave was seen leaving the house at 9:10 p.m. Yes, Wallace confirmed. A sharp exhale from the gallery. The case was airtight, everything fit. And yet... Charles Redgrave was not fighting. Agatha Marple shifted her gaze toward the accused. He had not flinched, had not protested. He sat with the stillness of a man who had made his peace with his fate. She had seen it before, not the guilt of a murderer, but the acceptance of a man who no longer saw the point in resisting. How very, unusual. She resumed knitting. The courtroom swelled with certainty, with the inevitability of justice. But Agatha Marple was quite certain of one thing. Nothing in this case was inevitable. The courtroom emptied in slow, deliberate waves, like water receding after a tide. A few members of the gallery lingered, speaking in hushed tones, their expressions a mixture of intrigue and self-satisfaction. After all, it was not every day that one witnessed a man slowly, methodically condemned before one's very eyes. Agatha Marple, however, remained seated, her knitting needles clicking softly. She was a woman who had learned long ago that the most revealing conversations happened in the spaces between official proceedings, in whispered exchanges, in careful glances, in the silences that lingered a second too long. A murmur behind her drew her attention. Emily Hawthorne, the widow, had not yet left. She stood near one of the great wooden pillars, speaking in low tones with the sympathetic matron in pearl. Agatha rose, adjusting her hat, and made her way toward her. "Mrs. Hawthorne," she said warmly, her voice light, conversational. Emily turned, her pale blue eyes flickering with faint surprise before settling into a composed smile. "Miss Marple, isn't it? Indeed, I am merely an observer, but one who finds herself quite drawn to this particular case." Emily inclined her head, the movement smooth, controlled. "It is a dreadful business." "Yes, quite." Agatha clasped her gloved hands in front of her. "It must have been a terrible shock to you." Emily hesitated, just for a moment, but long enough for Agatha to notice. "Yes," she said, softer now, her voice carrying the practised tremor of a woman in mourning. "Reginald was a strong man, but in the days before his death he seemed anxious." "Oh," Emily exhaled delicately, as though burdened by the memory. "He was restless, distracted. I asked him if anything was troubling him, but he brushed me off. He did that, you know, never one to share his burdens." Agatha nodded thoughtfully. "So he had reason to be nervous?" Emily's gaze flickered to just for a second, before she smoothed her expression like one might smooth the folds of a silk dress. "Well, I suppose I misinterpreted. He had no enemies, after all. He was respected, admired." A careful backtrack. Agatha tilted her head, her face unreadable. "No enemies? Not even Charles Redgrave?" Emily's lips pressed together just a fraction too tightly. "Business disputes happen, but one does not kill over such things, Miss Marple." "No," Agatha said pleasantly, "one does not." The scent of cigars and expensive cologne hung in the air as Paul Ashford lounged near one of the tall windows, basking in the golden afternoon light that spilled through the stained glass. He had discarded his courtroom demeanour in favour of something more leisurely, speaking in smooth, amused tones with a fellow gentleman who seemed equally at ease. When he noticed Agatha approaching, his smile widened, all charm and curiosity. "Ah," he said, inclining his head, "Miss Marple, was it?" She nodded. "I hope I am not interrupting." "Not at all," Paul said, his eyes gleaming with the lazy amusement of a man who has never known consequence. "To what do I owe the pleasure?" "I was quite interested in your testimony today," Agatha said, her voice mild. "You were very composed." Paul smirked. "Should I not be? It is hardly I who stands accused." "True," Agatha conceded, "though one might argue that a man who inherits a great deal of money following his uncle's death might feel a certain weight of scrutiny." Paul chuckled, as though the very notion was preposterous. Yes, the age-old suspicion of the heir. If I were an avid reader of detective novels, I would say I fit the part rather well, don't you think?" Agatha's lips curved slightly. "Avid readers of detective novels would also know that an obvious suspect is rarely the true culprit." Paul's smile remained fixed, but something about it cooled ever so slightly. She pressed on. "Tell me, Mr. Ashford, where exactly were you on the night of your uncle's murder?" Paul took a moment, straightening his cufflinks. "At my club. Playing cards. I have witnesses, of course." "Of course," Agatha said pleasantly. Paul leaned forward slightly. "Tell me, Miss Marple, do you believe Charles Redgrave to be guilty?" Agatha studied him, her blue eyes sharp behind her spectacles. "What I believe, Mr. Ashford, is that trials are often like fine embroidery. beautifully presented on the surface, but rather more complicated when examined closely. Paul's expression flickered, just for an instant. Then, with another effortless chuckle, he straightened. "A most delightful answer, Miss Marple." She smiled politely. "I do try." Later, as the courtroom prepared to resume, Agatha Marple sat back in her seat, her knitting resting in her lap. Emily Hawthorne had spoken too quickly, then retracted. Paul Ashford had been too rehearsed. And most importantly, Charles Redgrave, the man on trial, had done nothing to fight for his innocence. Agatha clicked her needles together once. The pattern, she thought, was beginning to emerge. The hush of the courtroom was deceptive. Beneath the polished grandeur, the dark mahogany walls, the glinting chandeliers, the austere gaze of Judge Alderton, was an undercurrent of something sharper, a hunger. Trials, Agatha Marple knew, were not only about justice. They were about stories, carefully constructed narratives, built upon facts that could be twisted, omitted, or exaggerated, depending on the storyteller's intent. And at this moment, Vivian Drake stood at the heart of it all, weaving her case with the precision of a master seamstress. The prosecutor's cool, measured voice cut through the chamber like the edge of a well-honed blade. "Members of the jury," she began, stepping toward the evidence table, "you have already heard that the relationship between Charles Redgrave and Reginald Hawthorne had deteriorated in recent months. What I present to you now is further proof of just how deep that animosity ran." She lifted a single sheet of paper, crisp and damning. "This note," she announced, "was discovered among Mr. Hawthorne's personal effects." She turned to the jury, letting the tension build before continuing. "A letter sent to him by none other than Charles Redgrave only 3 days before his death." A murmur rippled through the gallery. Even Judge Alderton shifted slightly in his seat. Drake took a deliberate pause before reading aloud. "If you continue to slander my name and meddle in affairs that do not concern you, I will have no choice but to stop you permanently." There it was. The courtroom held its breath. Drake folded the paper neatly, placing it back on the evidence table with an air of finality. Then, turning smoothly, she faced the accused. "Tell me, Mr. Redgrave," she said, her voice deceptively soft, "do you deny writing this?" Charles Redgrave had barely moved throughout the trial, but at this his mouth pressed into a firm line. For a long moment he said nothing. Then, with the resignation of a man already sentenced, he murmured, "I do not recall writing such a letter." A gasp rippled through the room. Beatrice Redgrave, seated in the gallery, let out an exaggerated sigh, as if such an answer was merely proof of her husband's treachery. Drake's eyes gleamed. "And yet the letter bears your signature." Redgrave remained silent. Beatrice Redgrave, a vision of icy composure, had taken the witness stand mere moments later. She had the bearing of a woman who had long since abandoned sentiment in favor of cold practicality. Her auburn hair was arranged with meticulous care, her high-collared dress impeccable. Yet her voice, for all its steel, was too rehearsed, too perfect. "I do not pretend," she announced to the court, "that my marriage to Charles Redgrave was a happy one." She cast a brief, disdainful glance toward her estranged husband. "He is a man of, shall we say, violent passions." Drake did not hide her satisfaction. "You mean to say he was capable of murder?" Beatrice's lips curved into something that was not quite a smile. "I mean to say that I would not be surprised." A collective shudder rippled through the jury box. In the second row, Agatha Marple remained very, very still. Beatrice was performing. A skilled performance, certainly, but to Agatha's trained ear it was a touch too forceful. A woman scorned, a wife betrayed. Such emotions did not always translate into gleeful condemnation. And yet here she was, carefully pushing the idea of her husband's guilt, rather than merely acknowledging it. A clever woman, Beatrice Redgrave, but perhaps too clever. The court recessed shortly after, and the heavy doors swung open as the murmuring crowd filtered into the grand hall beyond. Agatha, her expression serene, remained where she was, knitting needles clicking rhythmically. It was then, in the quiet lull of the emptying room, that she overheard it. A court clerk, speaking absent-mindedly to another as they gathered up the evidence. "I tell you, the writing on that letter, it looks awfully like Hawthorne's own." Agatha's hand stilled. A slow, quiet realization settled over her. A threatening letter, supposedly written by Redgrave, a letter found among Hawthorne's personal belongings, a letter that, by sheer coincidence, appeared to match the deceased's own handwriting. She exhaled, the smallest of smiles creeping at the corner of her lips. A man killed by a murderer, or perhaps a man who had been staging a murder before someone else got to him first. Agatha resumed her knitting, her mind already shifting the pieces into place. The pattern, she thought, was becoming ever so much more interesting. The morning air inside Courtroom No. 3 was dense with the weight of expectation. A subdued hush had settled over the gallery, the kind that often followed the momentary illusion of certainty. Yesterday's damning letter had painted Charles Redgrave as a man driven by rage, a man capable of murder. But Miss Marple knew better than most that certainty too quickly reached was rarely to be trusted. At the prosecution's table, Vivian Drake sat poised, her meticulous notes arranged in an impeccable row. She was a woman who prided herself on precision, but today, for the first time, there was the faintest flicker of irritation in her sharp features. Leonard Graves, Redgrave's beleaguered defense attorney, had taken the floor, his thin frame hunched over the witness stand as he addressed Detective Inspector Wallace. "You've stated that the murder weapon, Mr. Redgrave's revolver, was fired at close range, directly into the victim's chest," Graves said. His voice was steady, though he spoke with the cautious hesitation of a man walking a tightrope over open flames. Wallace nodded stiffly. "That is correct." "And yet," Graves continued, lifting a paper from the defense table, "the medical examiner's report states that the bullet entered the chest at a downward angle." A murmur rippled through the gallery. Wallace's mouth pressed into a thin line. "It is not uncommon for a man to slouch or be seated at the time of impact." Graves adjusted his spectacles. "Indeed. However, if we consider the victim's height, 6 feet, and compare it with Mr. Redgrave's, we find that he is of nearly identical stature." Another ripple. Graves turned slightly toward the jury. "And yet, for the shot to have entered the chest at that specific angle, the shooter would have to be significantly shorter than the victim." Vivian Drake rose abruptly. "This is a weak attempt at misdirection, Mr. Graves. The murder weapon belonged to the defendant." Graves did not so much as blink. "I am simply suggesting, Miss Drake, that the angle of the shot implies that the person holding the gun was either much shorter than the victim, or perhaps kneeling." Miss Marple's knitting needles clicked softly. How very interesting. That evening, after court had adjourned, Miss Marple found herself in the company of Emily Hawthorne once more. The widow had retreated to the marble-columned hallway outside the courtroom, her gloved hands folded over her morning dress, her eyes distant. "Such a dreadful business," Miss Marple murmured. Emily turned, managing a faint, brittle smile. "Yes, I suppose it is." Miss Marple's gaze remained mild. "Strange, though, that Mr. Hawthorne should be shot from such an angle." Emily hesitated, just long enough for Miss Marple to notice. "I wouldn't know," she said finally. "I told you I was in my room when it happened." "Yes," Miss Marple agreed. "Though of course you also said that you heard no gunshot." Emily's fingers tightened around the fabric of her gloves. "A small slip, perhaps an inconsequential one, or perhaps not. At precisely 8 o'clock the following morning, a disturbance at the Hawthorne estate sent the courtroom into fresh whispers of scandal. A break-in, the papers called it, though, curiously, there were no signs of forced entry. Miss Marple arrived at the estate shortly after, blending into the small crowd of onlookers gathered at the front gates. Inside, Detective Wallace was already present, his sharp gaze sweeping over the housekeeper, Mrs. Parker. "I tell you, sir, the doors were locked as always," the woman insisted. "And yet this morning Mr. Hawthorne's study was in disarray, papers scattered, drawers open." Wallace's gaze narrowed. "And you're certain the doors were locked?" Mrs. Parker faltered. For a fraction of a second, Miss Marple observed her carefully. There it was again, a pause, a hesitation. Something wasn't right. As Wallace turned toward the dishevelled study, Miss Marple stepped quietly inside. Her eyes swept across the fallen books, the overturned papers, and there, half hidden beneath a pile of documents, was a letter, one that, curiously enough, had not been mentioned in any police report. She bent slightly, plucking it up with careful fingers. Hawthorne's handwriting, but the ink was darker, newer. She scanned the page. A list of names, a sum of money, secret payments. To whom? And why had this letter disappeared, only to mysteriously reappear after a so-called break-in? The pieces of the puzzle shifted. Someone had wanted something from this study, but what? Miss Marple glanced at Mrs. Parker once more. The woman, usually so composed, was wringing her hands. She knew something, and Miss Marple intended to find out what. Back in the courtroom later that afternoon, Charles Redgrave remained silent, his resignation unchanged, though Miss Marple now had a suspicion as to why. She turned her gaze toward Beatrice Redgrave, whose expression was too composed, toward Paul Ashford, who had everything to gain, toward Emily Hawthorne, who had not heard a gunshot, but had hesitated when speaking of her husband's final days, and finally toward the missing letter that had resurfaced, its secrets whispering from the page. She smiled to herself. The story was shifting, and Miss Marple intended to follow it to its very end. The grand hall of the Old Bailey was a place of calculated movements. Here justice was not only dispensed, but also whispered about, in hushed tones, behind pillars, and over hastily sipped cups of tea. It was recess, and the air was thick with the murmurs of spectators dissecting the trial's latest revelations. The case of Charles Redgrave had turned stranger, the once simple murder of Reginald Hawthorne growing more tangled with each new thread. But Miss Marple knew that mysteries, like a well-knit pattern, had a way of revealing themselves, if one only knew where to look. Seated near a marble pillar, she appeared unremarkable, an elderly lady delicately occupied with her knitting, a figure so easily overlooked that one might not realize her keen blue eyes saw everything. And what she saw now across the hall near a shadowed alcove was most intriguing indeed. Beatrice Redgrave and Paul Ashford. Together! They spoke in low tones, heads inclined toward each other in a manner that suggested familiarity, intimacy even. Yet they shouldn't have been acquainted. Beatrice, the scorned wife of the accused. Paul, the ambitious nephew of the deceased. Their paths should not have crossed. And yet, Miss Marple's fingers paused on her yarn. What on earth did they have to say to one another? The exchange lasted only a moment, but the tension between them was palpable. Beatrice's gloved hand brushed against Paul's sleeve, a fleeting gesture, but not one of mere acquaintance. A warning, perhaps? Or something else? Paul's lips curled into an almost smile before he stepped away, adjusting his cufflinks with practised ease, leaving Beatrice standing alone. And then, the slightest shift, Beatrice's mask of composure faltered, just for an instant. Her fingers tightened around her handbag, her knuckles whitening. She was angry, or afraid. Miss Marple resumed knitting, but her thoughts were already spinning into neat, deliberate stitches. The next witness called to the stand was Beatrice Redgrave herself. She took her place before the courtroom with the same icy poise she had exhibited throughout the trial. But Miss Marple now knew what lay beneath. A woman who was not quite so controlled as she wished to appear. Vivian Drake, sharp-eyed and merciless, wasted no time. Mrs. Redgrave, you have testified that your husband was a difficult man. Beatrice's red lips curled into something akin to a smile. Difficult is an understatement. A polite chuckle rippled through the gallery. Drake pressed forward. You have made it abundantly clear that you believe him capable of murder. Beatrice's eyes gleamed. I believe he is capable of many things. Drake stepped closer. Tell me, Mrs. Redgrave, do you wish for your husband's conviction? A pause. a flicker of something indefinable in Beatrice's expression. Then, "I wish for justice." A clever answer, too clever. The recess, the whispered conversation, Beatrice's too perfect performance. It was all a little too rehearsed, too convenient. Miss Marple sat in the second row, her hands folded neatly in her lap, her knitting abandoned. Across the courtroom Paul Ashford sat, seemingly unbothered, idly twirling a silver signet ring between his fingers. A guilty man was one thing, a man who was far too comfortable in the midst of scandal, that was quite another. Miss Marple had learned long ago that people rarely hid nothing at all, they simply hid the wrong things. And now she knew where to look. A hush had fallen over courtroom No. 3, the kind that comes before a storm. The scent of polished wood and old parchment lingered in the air, thickened by the anticipation of final judgment. His lordship, Judge Alderton, peered down over his spectacles, gavel poised, his expression carved from stone. "Before I deliver my verdict," he announced, "is there any final submission?" The question was purely rhetorical. The trial had run its course. The evidence had been presented. Charles Redgrave had been condemned in every meaningful way, and yet a voice rang out, soft but unshakable. "Your Honour, we are about to sentence an innocent man while the true conspirators sit among us." Gasps rippled through the gallery. All heads turned toward the speaker, a small, unassuming woman in tweed, seated with a half-finished skein of knitting in her lap. Miss Agatha Marple. Judge Alderton's eyes narrowed. "Miss Marple, this is highly unorthodox." "I do apologize," she said, rising to her feet with perfect composure, "but I believe you would much rather hear the truth before rendering a decision that would send the wrong man to the gallows." For the first time in days, Charles Redgrave stirred. His weary, indifferent gaze flickered with something that looked very much like hope. Vivian Drake, ever the portrait of cool efficiency, stood abruptly. "Your Honour, this woman is an observer, not a legal authority. I do not claim to be one, Miss Drake," Miss Marple replied pleasantly, "but I do know a great deal about human nature, and I know when a murder has been staged by a dead man himself." Silence. The courtroom was listening now. Judge Alderton exhaled sharply. "Proceed, Miss Marple, but be brief." Miss Marple clasped her hands together. "The prosecution has painted a rather dramatic picture, has it not? A tale of rage and revenge. Mr. Redgrave, a man scorned, murders his business partner in a fit of fury, leaving behind a trail of damning evidence." She turned slightly, her gaze settling on Paul Ashford, who sat too still, too composed. "But what if I told you," she continued, "that this case was built on a fiction carefully designed by the victim himself?" The murmurs grew louder. Vivian Drake frowned. "What exactly are you suggesting?" Miss Marple tilted her head. "I am suggesting, Miss Drake, that Reginald Hawthorne was already dying." A stunned silence followed. Miss Marple's gaze swept across the courtroom. Mr. Hawthorne had been diagnosed with a fatal illness, and he knew his time was limited. But rather than face his fate quietly, he saw an opportunity, one final act of revenge against the man he had despised for years. She turned to Charles Redgrave. "Is it not true, Mr. Redgrave, that you once betrayed your partner?" Redgrave's jaw tightened. He hesitated, then nodded. "Years ago, yes, I took credit for a business deal that was not mine." Miss Marple nodded. "And so, faced with his impending death, Mr. Hawthorne decided to settle an old score. He forged the threatening letter. In his own hand, mind you, knowing it would frame you." Judge Alderton's brow furrowed. "But why go through such lengths?" Miss Marple turned toward Beatrice Redgrave and Paul Ashford. "Because, Your Honour, he had accomplices." Gasps rippled through the room. Beatrice Redgrave's perfectly composed mask faltered. Paul Ashford's fingers tightened around his silver signet ring. Reginald Hawthorne was not the only one who had something to gain from framing Mr. Redgrave. Miss Marple's voice remained steady, unhurried. "We know that after Hawthorne's death, The primary heir was his nephew, Mr. Ashford. A nephew who, might I add, had a certain fondness for expensive living. Paul scoffed, though his expression was far from amused. This is absurd. Miss Marple smiled pleasantly. Ah, but it is not. Because you were not the only beneficiary, were you? She turned to Beatrice now, her blue eyes keen. Mrs. Redgrave, I find it rather odd that you have been so very insistent on your husband's guilt. Beatrice's fingers twitched. I wonder, would it be because you knew that if he were convicted, his remaining assets, your assets, would pass directly into your control? Beatrice's lips parted, just slightly. A tiny, nearly imperceptible gasp slipped past them. Paul Ashford shifted uneasily beside her. Miss Marple let the weight of her words sink in before she continued. Mr. Hawthorne's plan was bold but incomplete. He set the stage, created the illusion of a crime, but someone else took the opportunity to make it real. She turned toward Detective Wallace. Tell me, Inspector, what was the precise time of death? Wallace hesitated. Between 9:05 and 9:15 p.m. Miss Marple nodded. Curious, then, that the only person known to have left the house at that time was Mr. Redgrave himself. And yet he could not have fired the gun. Wallace frowned. And why not? Because, Miss Marple said, her voice cool, certain, the autopsy revealed that the angle of the gunshot was too low. The shooter was either much shorter than the victim or kneeling. A ripple of realization spread through the court. She turned to Beatrice. A woman of your height, Mrs. Redgrave, would be the perfect fit, wouldn't she? Beatrice's breath hitched. Paul rose abruptly, but Wallace's firm hand on his shoulder kept him in place. Miss Marple continued, Reginald Hawthorne set the trap, but it was you, Mrs. Redgrave, who pulled the trigger. A sudden intake of breath. The moment the web of deception collapsed in on itself. Beatrice Redgrave's face drained of colour. Paul Ashford, his composure finally cracked, cursed under his breath. And Charles Redgrave, the man who had accepted his fate so quietly, exhaled, as though he had been holding his breath for days. The truth had been unmasked. Reginald Hawthorne, already a dying man, had set a final wicked trap. Paul Ashford, driven by greed, had sought to profit from it. And Beatrice Redgrave, eventually scorned, vengeful, had taken the opportunity to be rid of her husband for ever, and nearly succeeded. Miss Marple, satisfied, resumed her knitting. Fascinating, she murmured to herself. The things people will do for money. The gavel struck, and the case was closed. The great oak doors of Courtroom No. 3 swung open with a slow, ponderous creak, as if reluctant to release its latest occupants into the waiting world. The sharp winter air rushed in, clearing away the heavy scent of stale parchment, sweat, and conviction. Charles Redgrave stepped into the light of freedom, though he did not move like a free man. His broad shoulders, once proud and unyielding, bore the invisible weight of all that had transpired, not only the trial, but the years before it, the choices and betrayals that had set this whole wretched ordeal into motion. He had been spared the noose, but justice was not so kind as to let him walk away unscathed. At the far end of the corridor, Beatrice Redgrave and Paul Ashford were led away under the watchful eyes of Detective Wallace and the bailiffs. Beatrice, her composure now brittle as fine porcelain, carried herself with the defiant grace of a woman who had spent too long wearing armour. Paul Ashford, by contrast, twisted and fought against his fate to the bitter end, barking curses at the officers as he was dragged through the doors. Agatha Marple sat quietly in the second row, watching the final procession with an air of mild interest, her knitting needles clicking softly. She did not exult in victory. Victory was for games, and justice was never a game. The court had overturned Charles Redgrave's conviction. A shocking turn for the papers, no doubt, but Miss Marple knew better than most that truth was never quite so simple as guilt or innocence. Charles was free, yes, but he was not innocent. Had he killed Reginald Hawthorne? No. But had he betrayed him once, years ago, setting into motion the very events that led to the man's death? Yes. Had he allowed himself to be condemned out of a misguided sense of atonement? Yes. Had he, in his own way, been willing to let the lie stand, until someone else had chosen to fight for the truth in his stead? Yes. And that was Justice's great uncomfortable secret, wasn't it? It was never quite as neat as the newspapers liked to print. One did not leave entirely blameless, nor did one leave entirely condemned. In the corridor, Charles hesitated, his breath curling in the cold air. He turned back, his green eyes settling on Miss Marple, who had not yet moved from her seat. "I suppose I should thank you," he said, his voice quieter than it had ever been in court. Miss Marple did not look up from her knitting. "That depends," she said mildly, looping a thread. "Are you grateful to be free, or merely relieved not to be hanged?" Charles exhaled a soft laugh, though there was no humour in it. "I suppose," he admitted, "a bit of both." Miss Marple finally glanced at him, her sharp blue eyes unreadable behind her spectacles. "You have been given something very few people receive, Mr. Redgrave." She tilted. "And what would you have me do with it, Miss Marple?" She smiled. "A small, knowing thing." "Oh, that is entirely up to you, dear," she said, resuming her knitting. "But a second chance is only useful to those who intend to make use of it." Charles nodded once, a gesture of understanding, or perhaps simply farewell, and then turned toward the waiting doors. They closed behind him with a heavy finality. The courtroom had emptied. Only Miss Marple remained, her needles working steadily, though her mind was far elsewhere. Justice had been served, in the way that justice always was, imperfectly, humanly, and without the clean lines that people so desperately wanted. The guilty man had walked free. The innocents had not been as innocent as they appeared, and the truly guilty had not been quite as monstrous as one might have imagined. Miss Marple let out a small sigh, tucking her knitting into her bag. Her gaze flickered once toward the great oak doors, where Beatrice and Paul had been led away only minutes before. "One should never be too sure of the guilty," she murmured softly to herself, rising from her seat, "nor too quick to pardon the innocent." And with that she stepped out of the courtroom, leaving behind the opulence, the whispers, and the weight of the law, and walking, as she always did, toward the next mystery.